A pioneer in public finance since 1955, Ehlers helps clients build outstanding places to live, work, learn, and play by delivering focused, fully integrated financial advisory services. We work with more than 1,500 local governments, schools, development authorities, and public agencies, placing their needs and best interests at the heart of everything we do. We help our clients navigate all facets of public finance, including financial management planning, economic development and redevelopment, debt issuance and management, investments and treasury management, and arbitrage consulting. At Ehlers, we believe strong communities aren't simply the result of transactions. They're the result of people. We build strong, long-lasting client relationships, collaborating with your staff to complete projects and drive new initiatives forward. Building strong, vibrant, and sustainable communities. Together, it's what we do. For more information, call us at 1-800-552-1171 or visit ehlers-inc.com.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for Ehlers' virtual session to discuss affordable and workforce housing. I'm Phil Cosson, Senior Municipal Advisor with Ehlers. Before I introduce my colleagues and panelists, I have three quick housekeeping items to mention that will help ensure you have a good, interactive experience with us. You'll notice in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, there are two icons. One is called Live Q&A, and the other is Chat. As we move through today's presentation, if you have a question you'd like us to answer, simply open the Q&A tab, type it in, and submit. We'll take a few breaks during our time together to answer the questions you've submitted. You can also have a conversation with fellow attendees throughout the session by clicking on the chat icon. One thing to note, while you can submit any question anonymously, in the event we're not able to get to all questions today, we recommend you allow us to see your information so that we can reach out to you directly with specific answers or to discuss further. Lastly, if at any point during our presentation you start to notice either video or audio lag, please go ahead and refresh your browser so that you can get right back on track. Now that we've covered those items, let's go ahead and get started. I'd like to introduce my colleague, Frank Roman, who is an Economic Development Advisor with Ehlers, and our three panelists, Sig Strautmanis with General Capital, Nick Young with Cardinal Capital, and Scott Kwasinski with the Horizon Group. We want to thank our panelists for taking time out of their very busy schedules to participate today. I will turn it over to Frank to lead us through the initial slides of our presentation. Frank?
Good morning, and thanks. We're going to start out more of kind of some of the technical aspects of the affordable and workforce housing programs, and then we'll take some Q&A partway through, and then the second half will lead into a little bit more of an open discussion on some of these concepts and projections. So just kind of starting out with some of this. What is affordable housing? Affordable housing is defined as households earning between 30 and 80% of the AMI, or the area median income. And the goal is to have these households be able to cost less than 30% of their household income. Now, there's other programs where we're typically focusing on the LIHTC projects, which is low income housing tax credits, which affords the developer to be able to charge lower rents to make these affordable, and helps their capital stack, which you'll see in a bit. And that's called Section 42 of the IRS code. So the difference in that and workforce housing, workforce is defined as housing that's available to households making 80% or less of the AMI based on the number of persons in that household. That's households or incomes are too low to afford the range of housing options in the communities where those residents want to work and live. So that's a bit of a difference in those concepts, but similar overall in those in how we get through that. So let's talk briefly about some of the financing considerations in this. Generally, there's two phases. There's obviously the construction phase, which is generally financed by WIDA bond, Wisconsin Housing and Economic Development Authority bond. And then moving into the permanent loan is when most of the tax credits are made available. The permanent loan is placed on the project. There's also a number of ancillary project slices, if you would, Federal Reserve Home Programs or AHP. And then there's other soft loan programs, which may or may not have an interest component. They may or may not be forgivable. So just a very dynamic combination of financing tools here, which we'll get into in just a little bit. Also, there's a process through the QAP or the Qualified Action Plan, which helps through the scoring of this. All the different components, building and land, et cetera, are scored in a different measure. Land, in particular, is a cost that you'd like to try to find the municipality to convey the land to you for a low price, rather than to buy it outright at market, which could hurt your scoring system. So some other financing considerations, because the rents are restricted by the WIDA program due to the different levels of AMI, 30, 50, 60% levels, rents are restricted according to those income levels. So there's not a lot of value production or incremental value production due to that. So that permanent loan may only be 50% of the total capital piece. WIDA permanent loans could provide a 35-year amortization, but it comes with a higher interest rate of about 5.75% or 5.35%. Other considerations in this is there's a higher development fee that's allowable to the developers that helps increase the eligible basis of the project in order to qualify for additional tax credits to make this really work. So we'll continue on with some of the application considerations. Again, I mentioned the Qualified Action Plan of the QAP. This is revised every 2 years according to market considerations, but this lays out how the projects are, the applications are received and scored. And these guys are going to get into this a little bit more on how those scoring considerations work. And after this project is scored and allocated, there's also timing considerations of this too. The applications are due by December, but the awards are not actually formalized until April. As a matter of fact, yesterday was the formal announcement of those awards. So there's quite a time lag in that, and then once the awards are allocated, then you have to ramp up for construction start probably that fall. So there's a long timeline or gestation period in doing this as well. We can ask start with Sig, I guess, for some of your considerations on the application process and the QAP, and the other gentlemen can chime in as they find it able to do so.
Sure. No, thanks, Frank. My general observation, well, couple, is that the QAP changes every couple of years. And typically that QAP is going to reflect what the current priorities are of each of these allocating agencies. So in Wisconsin, it's WIDA. In Illinois, it's IDA, the Illinois Housing Development Authority. In Michigan, it's MISHDA. And so we found over the years, you can kind of understand and appreciate what the priorities are through the scoring process in the QAP. And sometimes it's more urban-oriented development, Main Street style development, and sometimes it's more rural. And so that's one of the tricks, and actually one of the struggles of the program is to kind of read the tea leaves of where the QAP is going, because what you brought up, Frank, is a really good point. Is the gestation period on these projects is really pretty long, and you can be working on a project before the new QAP comes out. So you kind of have an idea of what these agencies are looking for, but really until that QAP comes out, it doesn't really get nailed down. So I think that's one of the kind of challenges of participating in this program.
Yeah, well, actually, you didn't mention that. I noticed in the awards yesterday, they mentioned that of the 33 communities that were, or 33 projects that were approved, 7 of them were noted in rural communities, and that it was noted that that's going to be a future consideration to try to incorporate more outstate or rural projects as well, which we'll talk about in a bit also. If you could also kind of talk about the capital stack and some of these alternate or these other sources of funds, besides the permanent loan and the tax credits. Scott, why don't you kind of touch base on your processes in financing, putting all the pieces together to finance a project like this?
Yeah, no, that's good, Frank. I think it's really important to highlight how great of a resource the tax credits are. I mean, and usually the deals end up stacking up that 50 to 60% of the total capital stack comes from tax credits. So that really, I mean, as opposed to a traditionally financed project where, you might have only 25% equity in a deal, these affordable housing projects really leverage that private investment through tax credits. So that's a huge boon to the project. In terms of loan size, we see anywhere between 20 and 30% of the project being funded through a permanent mortgage. And then really what that kind of leaves is a gap in the project financing. And that's an important one to talk about, just because that is really where a lot of these projects get their legs, so to speak. It could be a municipality stepping forward and offering, some public participation in the form of tax increment financing. It could be through, home funding. It could be through CDBG funding. It could be a low interest loan. There just has to be some other mechanism in the project that allows the project to gain financial feasibility. And especially in this kind of time period of increasing construction costs and different factors inside in the model and the projections, it's really becoming increasingly difficult to see projects work. So that would be one item that I really stress is, first of all, is the importance of the tax credits and leveraging that in the deal. And secondly is, I think, municipalities being able to step forward and offer that assistance.
Yeah. I mean, we often see that the request for tax increment financing assistance in these projects. Can you touch base on the scoring mechanism and how important that is in the whole process as well?
Sure. I mean, so the scoring process really is kind of based on a financial leverage idea, where essentially, if you think about it from a big picture view, WIDA has a certain allocation of tax credits. I think it's between 14 and 15 million for the 9% competitive, and that has to get spread out across the entire state through all kinds of different communities and everyone has affordable housing needs. And so that's really a resource that they're trying to allocate across the state. And they incentivize developers in these projects to rely as less as they can, I guess is a way of saying it, as on those tax credits in their capital stack. So the more funding that you can actually go out and get from soft funding sources, whether it's an AHP or like I said, the TIF or other things, it helps your scoring out because you're relying less and less on tax credits and you're helping other projects in the state to move ahead.
Exactly. Thank you.
Frank,
I'm sorry,
Frank,
go ahead.
if I can just chime in real quick. We had an initial question I thought would be good to get feedback from the group on. There was a question regarding the capital stack, and we were looking for a little more information on, and we went through that relatively quickly on the capital stack. And we're talking about some of the components right now, like funding for low interest loans or tax increment district. I was wondering if, Nick, maybe you could walk us through kind of a typical deal and the different funds that you're looking to tap into. One I hear about often is home funds. Not something that we deal with a great deal, but I hear that's part of the capital stack often. So I wonder if maybe you could walk through kind of a typical deal and the different sources that you're looking to tap into to try to get a deal done. Maybe on one you recently were just awarded.
Sure. So going really back to what Scott talked about, I mean, typically in your stack, especially on a tax credit project, you're looking at the tax credits being somewhere around that 50% range, could be a lot higher, could be a lot lower, depends on the project. What whether that's essentially saying you're being awarded, 800,000, you're getting 10 years of that. So that fills the stack depending on how you price those tax credits with your syndicator, because you're syndicating those credits. So your tax credit syndicator, if you get, say, 8 million in total credits, they're maybe giving you somewhere between 90 and 100 cents on the dollar, depending on the type of project. So, you're getting approximately 7 million, and say it's a $10 million total stack. Home funds is a project. We typically use a lot of home funds, especially in Milwaukee County. We're working a lot with continuing repair and on the supportive services set aside. And so that's typically 500,000, and that will be used to cover usually 4 units. And then you possibly could have project-based vouchers, which really helps fill your income from that side. And additionally, like CDBG funds, AHPs, almost always critical, and we've been talking about this earlier. Typically in Wisconsin, if you're getting awarded, you're usually going to have more soft funds to fill. So it's applying for those AHP funds to fill the remaining portion of that. In addition to whether that's TIF, a couple of recent projects, we've done PAYGO TIF, we're monetizing that up front. Of course, it's a lot easier if you can get upfront TIF, but that's another piece of the capital stack that helps fill it. But another one is a recent tax credit project was part of a donation agreement with a local healthcare provider that donated the project or the land to the project. But again, it's really that public-private partnership that helps really get the project over that line to help fill that capital stack to make sure that you can get the project done and serve whatever community you're serving.
And Nick, if we could just expand real quickly on that, you mentioned the syndication of the tax credits and the length of time, et cetera. Maybe for the benefit of the community here, that we could expand on that and just kind of explain how that works. First of all, that the credits are actually the tax credit investor is buying a dollar for dollar offset against their taxes, not against their taxable income, but against their taxes itself. But there's a period of time that those come in over 6 to 10 years, depending on the type of credit that they're buying. So could you elaborate a little bit further on that?
Sure, absolutely. Just going a little bit to the time frame itself. Typically, as we mentioned, the applications were due in December, at least for the 9% here in Wisconsin, and we got awarded, or developers got awarded earlier this week. So now at this point, we're usually going to be spending the next 6 to 12 months working with one of a dozen syndicators throughout the United States, working on monetizing that amount and finalizing that piece of it, finalizing any soft costs. So that process could be anywhere from 6 months to a year, if not longer, depending on how long it takes to get the awards, especially with AHP, whether you're going to Pittsburgh, Chicago, depending on the office, on when they're allocating those funds. So it could be anywhere from the next 6 months to a year, if not longer, depending on when your syndicator is looking to have those funds come in so they can use those for who they're syndicating the funds with.
And the tax credits are awarded over a period or provided over a period of up to 10 years, depending if they're the 9% deal. So there's a cash flow of that for a 10-year period over the investor's 15-year initial hold. We can talk about some of that later too, but just to give an idea of the timing of some of this and how this is being provided to the development capital. So
right, and that can play into the syndicator or whoever the investor is with the syndicator in a certain market, whether they're going into an area, whether they want CRA credits, that could affect the pricing. So there's a lot of factors that go into pricing that as they're essentially monetizing it over that 10-year period.
And Scott, can you kind of talk about who are the buyers for these credits? I know there's a little bit of a vast universe out there, but
yeah, there's 2 kind of buckets that I think about when when we get tax credits, just like other developers, we're trying to find the best price for those tax credits that really, as Nick was alluding to, is the driver of how much capital comes into your project. And so there's direct investors, and then there's also a syndicator. So a direct investor could be like a Wells Fargo or US Bank. PNC, there's a lot of different direct investors out there that have a tax liability themselves that they are looking to offset. And then there's also syndicators that look, essentially are grouping together investors and working directly with the developer to kind of bring that capital into the project as well. So we've worked with both before. So I think that's my experience. I don't know, Sig, if you want to offer anything else on that.
No, very similar. Lately, we've been working more directly with direct investors, U.S. Bank and the like, but we've done some syndicated deals. And I'll say that when we're dealing with historic credit, which is kind of an interesting overlay on top of this, that's usually somebody that can use the credit because there's a state credit of 20% and then there's a federal credit on top of that. So it's kind of like somebody that can use that credit efficiently. And that's been through a syndicator. So yeah, we've had the same experience, Scott.
And the direct investor, you talk about the banks, U.S. Bank and PNC, they're using that more for their CRA investment requirements, whereas the private individuals, the syndicators, are using it more for the private investor against their income tax.
Yep, you'll find that depending on where those bank locations are, they'll be hungrier to get after certain communities, and that kind of goes right to that CRA need they may have. So you may see that their pricing is better in certain areas than others. So there's always those geographic, I think, preferences, and we're always kind of talking with those direct investors as we have ideas about affordable housing in certain locations to get a beat on what the pricing may be. So yes, it does depend on location.
Well, I'll just mention that a couple of years ago, we had a project that got pricing over $1 because of the CRA. That's really unusual, but it's hypothetically possible when you actually have a situation like that. So there's a need.
And Frank, one thing I'll add on this slide with regard to timing, I'll kind of underscore what Sig was talking about before, is that the timing generally takes quite a long time to have an affordable housing project actually move to completion. So like right now, we're looking for sites for the upcoming round, which I think someone mentioned the December application cycle. So we're looking to get sites under control now and for the next couple of months, just so that we can make an application in December. Then April of 22 would be when the awards come out. And then if you think about all the work that needs to take place with regard to underwriting, project design, any entitlement that occurs, it's probably at the earliest you're talking about a fall 22, if not spring 23 type closing and construction start, which could lead then to a full 12 months after that is when your project is delivered. So a site right now I might not be putting into service until early 24 is kind of my comment on that. So it's a longer term, traditionally funded project can sometimes happen a lot quicker. But I think there's a huge need out there for affordable housing. And I also think with the capital stack that's involved, and capital stack, by the way, the definition of that is sort of all the funding sources that come together that allow a project, an affordable housing project to be fully funded. But when that comes together, it's just a lot of work. It's a lot of putting things together. I always kind of say there's a lot of ducks that have to line up in a row to make it happen.
Exactly. Well, there's another part of this this process is the compliance considerations of the program. So we touched base real briefly on the income qualifications. Again, for each different AMI, there's income levels. The manager has to vet those and make sure ongoing that those rents are attuned to those different tenants at their income levels. There's also reporting requirements to go along with that. So the operating costs of doing these type of projects is a little bit elevated as well. We talked briefly about the development fee being able to be kind of aggregated to work on the better scoring, but also the developer is required to leave 50% of that fee in as a deferred fee, but then they have to recover that over a 15-year period. Otherwise, it becomes a taxable issue for their investors as well. So lastly, I'm just kind of running through these real quickly. For any affordable project, there's a 30-year LURA, or a land use restriction agreement, that the project has to remain affordable for that period. Now, the initial investor may be in there for 15 years, but the project itself is designated affordable for 30 years. So then you have to, recalibrate the capital and the ownership at that point as well. So, Sig, can you kind of talk a little bit about some of these compliance issues and how you manage that?
Yeah, I mean, in our particular case, Frank, we actually outsource the management and compliance because it's really complex. In a market rate situation, we have a couple of market rate apartment buildings that we do manage ourselves and some student housing that we manage ourselves. But when you're getting into compliance, the worst nightmare of any developer that's guaranteeing a project like this is a concept of recapture, where basically if you get yourself into enough trouble, hypothetically, the developer can be on the hook for the credit if it ends up being, I'll call it, in default. And so we really rely on third-party managers to handle this that have the expertise. And, as tempting as it seems to keep that in-house, at least for us, we've just found that the compliance issues are serious enough that we seek outside expertise for that.
Yeah. And you have does that manager provide you some type of security or guarantee for them to manage that on your behalf?
Yeah, well, basically it's a contractual type of relationship, right? And also, we like to be pretty heavily involved in what I'll call the asset management side. We have regular calls. We know what's going on. We kind of agree on the budgets each year. And I frankly get the phone calls when there's problems. We have this issue with X, Y, and Z. Sometimes you have a tenant resident that becomes an issue. We kind of get involved in some of that resolution. But really we're relying on them to do their job, right? But I would say that on the spectrum of owners, we tend to be more on the active ownership side. I think just because you have to. It's kind of like doing your own taxes or something. Sometimes you just feel like I really need to know what's going on instead of just relying on somebody and their word, And
ultimately it's your responsibility also.
It is.
I agree with Sig. It's a very important part of the tax credit development process is to have a property management company. And frankly, that's what a syndicator and an operating agreement helps to cover too. I mean, they're also looking for a property manager that is well qualified and experienced. And we manage about 3,000 units ourselves. And that's the whole reason we have a whole compliance department, is to just literally handle all the annual recertifications that come in and making sure that these tax credit properties are functioning the way that they're supposed to be. So it is a very serious component of the development process.
I agree with Scott and Sig on this. It's, we self-manage all of our projects, including LIHTC and market rate. And for us especially, it's knowing we're committing to at least 15 years. And for us, it's typically longer, working with either our partners or whoever's wherever we're doing to buy out the credits at the end of it or take over the project. We know we need to commit to 15 years. We need to maintain compliance because, as Sig said, recapture can be a huge issue and can hurt you in going forward, getting credits or even being a property manager and owner going forward.
I can just maybe chime in one last thought on that, and that is sometimes municipalities and neighbors worry about affordable housing in their communities. And my typical response is these are probably among the most heavily managed with multiple layers of oversight, be it that the investor, be it the ownership, property management layers. I mean, I would, that's a very strong argument for, a problem resident or something, a problem for us. We don't want problems, right? And the community, we're going to be on the same page as it relates to those kind of issues. But it really is true that there's just multiple layers of oversight in these projects.
Very good point, because there can be some NIMBYism, if you would, on when the word affordable housing is brought up. But as you mentioned, the active management from professional firms such as yourselves, certainly addresses that. One of the other things we kind of touched base on in the previous conversation was the type of product that's being developed. So when you're seeing affordable housing, it's not low budget construction. Most of these projects have higher finishes. They have some amenities that other market rate products do as well. So it's not a trashy type of a project, but it's actually, some of them actually have some market rate tenants in there as well. So you're building a higher quality project, just that the tax credit program allows you to build it more efficiently and to provide for this much needed housing option.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that back up, Frank. It's a real salient point to touch on, is that especially in communities where I would say your rent per square foot in a more traditional project, might be lower in more rural areas and things like that, is that we're often seeing that the tax credit product itself is either as good or better than in terms of quality than you would otherwise see. Because in a traditional project, you're really just relying on, it's just your rents that are funding the project, right? I mean, however high your rents are is how high your mortgage can be. And you have to have a certain return in your equity to drive that part of it. So your budget is quite constrained in a traditional market rate project in a rural community. So like I said, the capital stack that comes with affordable housing can really offer maybe even a better product in your community,
Very good point. Thank you for elaborating on that. So.
And related to that, Frank, if I might add, going back to the concept of the QAP, some of the quality is driven through the QAP as well. For example, WIDA now requires that you achieve a certain level of scoring in the Green Built Home program. Wisconsin Environmental Initiative has a Green Built Home program. It used to be an alternative scoring category, but now there's actually a floor that you need to achieve. So all these new projects that will be coming out are going to have a minimum threshold, call it, green building sustainability aspect to it. And then, similarly, universal design features, you get points for those. You get points for providing certain amenities, internet to the resident, et cetera. So, to WIDA's credit, if you think about the bigger picture here and you want high quality, affordable housing, the developers are competing on that basis. So I think that's really positive, frankly.
And you'll have amenities like, in-unit washers and dryers and community areas where people can gather as well. So
yeah, exactly.
It's not a bare bones cheap product. It's actually, and as Scott mentioned, can even be better than what the market would otherwise provide. So, okay. Well, if there's no other comments on that, we can take a quick break for Q&A. Phil, do you have a few?
We have a couple of questions. Yep, a couple of questions, and then I have a few questions that I'd like to get on the table as well. So maybe I'll start with one of the questions that came forward. I have heard that it takes $40,000 to put together a tax credit application. How do rural communities encourage developers to put such an application together in their community? So maybe we'll start with Nick on that one.
Yeah, that's a great question. Typically developers are going to have a large commitment going into it, whether that's acquisition of land, just your general due diligence, surveys, phase ones, getting entitlements. And I think going back to what we originally started to talk with, just that public-private partnership, understanding what is going to go into the project, what the community's needs are, whether the community's available and ready. NIMBYA is always going to be something, especially with capital A affordable housing, whether that's actually, or it's just workforce housing. I think it needs to be open to working with the developer and having conversations and just being able to have those conversations and commit to here's what a developer is typically going to need. Here's what we can do. And, that's being open to possibly providing incentives through a TIF or providing incentives through land at a very, very cheap cost, or helping with remediation, demolition, any of those type of costs, and knowing what the city is looking for for their community and to support their community.
I think go ahead, Sig.
No, I was just going to say that, as it relates to the cost of putting a deal together, they're very real dollars, and they're speculative dollars, right? And so in our case, what we try to do is only go after projects that we really sincerely believe are going to score. Basically, you have to be brutally honest with yourselves, and a community, if they do some legwork, then they can kind of know how they fit into that spectrum of possibility, right? We look at a lot of deals, and then we keep kind of paring them down, evaluating them against a QAP, against a scoring, and we finally say, which one of these really is worth pursuing? And then that's when the dollars start rolling. But it does take an investment. I think almost more importantly, an investment of professional time rather than, paying consultants. You can only do so much, right?
So second question, maybe for you, Scott, that I've been thinking about a little bit, because I hear from many communities that I work with that their first foray into this type of product may be more appealing if it's senior versus workforce, to kind of meet that demand or that need in the community. Getting back to this QAP that we've been hearing about through the conversation, and seems to be shifting. Can you give us maybe a little historical and maybe a little vision going forward as to what you see as what's happened in the past, what's been the priority the last couple of years, how that's changed with this last QAP and the awards, and then maybe what you foresee going forward?
With senior versus family, Phil, or?
Yeah. I think that's kind of one that we hear about a great deal on the ground, is senior versus workforce.
I think right now the senior versus family concept is pretty much on a level playing field, it seems like. It wasn't always that way. If you kind of went back in time, and probably as recently as 5 or 7 years ago, the QAP was a bit more slanted in terms of incentivizing family development. It seemed like there was a couple senior opportunities that we were looking at that just didn't score as well, and so I think that was maybe a preference. But I think that's kind of evened out here. And there's ways of getting senior housing projects to score right now that are kind of equal to family. And really what it involves, though, is maybe just a little bit more land area, just because, in fact, one of them that I just recently closed on and started construction in the Milwaukee area is a senior, what's called majority elderly project. And so we worked on a senior project, and then on the same site in a separate building had townhomes, 3-bedroom townhomes that we could offer, because there's a point scoring item that's called serves large families that allows you to score points for having 3-bedroom units and offering those to a non-age restricted demographic. So that would be one way to help score points there and kind of put that on a level playing field. So we've done that successfully. I know other developers have as well, but it does require just a little bit more land area. I think that it's kind of community to community in terms of what the need is. And, one thing, well, I think that there's a need for affordable housing, period, whether that's senior or family. In terms of senior, I do think that there's an aging demographic there. There's all, people may also be on a fixed income, and so there's challenges financially that they may endure. And these are also seniors too, remember, that are part of the fabric of your community, that have been there for probably 30 years or something like that simply just want to remain in your community, but there may not be an option for them. And so this could be a nice option to be able to move that forward.
So following up on that QAP, what visibility do you have in the change that occurs from time to time as to what will score well and what won't? Is it more of a known, or is it something that kind of changes on the dime and you're reacting? Maybe Sid, you want to take that one?
Sure. I mean, I think that generally speaking, I think that WIDA doesn't also like to put shocks out in the development community necessarily. We've seen incremental change And you can anticipate it. You kind of hear about it. WIDA does reach out. There's focus groups and things like that. Michigan does a really good job of putting draft QAPs out there multiple times, and you kind of get to chime in. But yeah, with the senior thing, it's just interesting. As an example of the evolution, several years ago, many moons ago, we'd actually emphasized assisted living, and there was actually points for RCAC. Those don't exist anymore. That kind of evolved a little bit, and then as Scott alluded to, the whole idea that bringing senior more on a level playing field with the family deals is WIDA allowed in the last QAP to combine senior and family in one project. It's kind of these incremental evolutions. So I think that generally speaking, the agencies don't like to, lob a whole new, this paradigm shift out to the development community. Sometimes you get a little surprised, and sometimes there's some scoring differences, and they have different implications, like the leverage points, for example, in Wisconsin really require you to go after a lot of soft money. That is, I will say that for where we work, that's unique to Wisconsin. In Michigan, you can get through a deal without as much soft money, but things like that, there's some tweaks that happen over the years, but they try not to do wholesale, changes and drop them out. Is that? Do you agree?
Nick or Scott, you want to add that?
I would agree with that. Yeah, that's typically, especially here in Wisconsin. Especially seeing additional soft funds here in Wisconsin. Other states we work in, like Colorado, and there, you'll rarely see a huge change to the QAP, but on occasions, CHAFA has just made very surprising things, especially with new federal laws coming in, and they also have tax on marijuana sales. So, utilizing those credits versus Wisconsin is, you have a good idea, but, and Scott alluded to this, adding townhomes and family units, especially over the last changes in the QAP has been a big piece of it. So you can anticipate a little bit. You might make some changes in the design to help facilitate it, but you're not going to make significant changes, and it might maybe push one project over the edge over another.
So another question that kind of came out of our previous discussion that I thought maybe would be important to get on the table is my understanding that the investors are really required to participate for 15 years in these projects. And so if you're sitting on the other side of the aisle and you're a mayor or village president and or staff of a community, and you're talking about what happens after the 15 years, once that investor participation goes away on these projects, I think that's something that people would, probably worry a little bit about, that NIMBYism we talked about earlier, the perception that this is going to deteriorate after that period of time. I was wondering, maybe Scott, you want to start with that one and talk a little bit about what your practice is once that period of time lapses, and then second, kind of what's the history of what you guys have done?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm glad you're bringing that up. As you mentioned, the tax credits is a 10-year stream. That's what the investor is really interested in. And then after that, there's a 5-year compliance period. So it's a total of 15 years that the investor is kind of tied to the project. Usually what happens, so there's a single purpose entity that's created, an LLC essentially for the project. That investor owns 99.99% of that project. It's also governed by an operating agreement that you negotiate in the early going of the project before you close. So that operating agreement usually contains information in terms of how that property is treated at year 15 and what the ownership changes might look like. Usually there is an opportunity to, for us, for example, we would, and I think others can echo this, is that we have an opportunity to enter into the ownership of that project, and then based on our own mission, of providing affordable housing for the long term, and in combination with the fact that the LURA is also, the land use restriction agreement is also for 30 years, it will remain affordable housing, and then it's also going to remain in our hands, for example, if it's Horizon, where we have an ownership interest and also the property management to oversee it. And so we are in it for the long term. And I think that's kind of an important point to bring up, is that at year 15, it doesn't it's not going to sell to become a market rate project, number one. And number two, it's generally not going to be sold either to some random entity that you have no idea who they are. Usually it's the developer at day one is the one that's interested in being the owner.
Great, thank you. So the next question that came forward, I think really will allow us to go on to the next slide, which really gets into a little musical interlude.
Intermission's over.
Yeah, so if we go to the next slide, I think the question always comes forward. And this is a question that just came forward from one of the folks that are participating and attending. What factors are most important to a developer in deciding where to propose an affordable or workforce housing project, and what can a community do to attract these types of projects? And so on the slide that we had put together, I really targeted 3 different areas that I think are where communities have to focus. One is community readiness, and whether or not communities have gone through the process of potentially rezoning property. If it's in a redevelopment area, do they have a redevelopment plan in place that will lead to the ability to undertake these type of projects? And then, again, dealing with the not in my backyard folks, which is always a bit of a challenge and a bit of an unknown, quite frankly, when you get into these projects. So, having that community readiness, vision, and political will. The third, to me, is always the biggest challenge to understand, the political will. But you do need to have someone champion a project, I believe, besides you, the developer. So could you talk maybe about the question that was raised in regards to community readiness, political will, and a vision of a community as a way to attract, or where they have to be in the process to attract projects like you're bringing forward. So Nick, do you want to start with that one?
Sure. This is something similar. We were talking about earlier, Phil, is, and for me, it's definitely been a combination of the 3. The community being ready and willing to do these type of developments. I will say, the political will is right. It's very difficult to understand, but having that champion, whether it's the city administrator, a mayor, or just a common council that's saying, we, recognize we need this type of housing in our project, whether that's capital A affordable, workforce housing, and working with us to understand whether or not the QAP makes sense. And because for us, it still needs to be a financially viable project, whether it fits on the AMI, as Scott talked about earlier. Does it make sense to do that type of project? For us, we'll look at different communities as a LIHTC project. Otherwise, we would love to do some sort of workforce housing. That way, we're maybe not restricted by those low-income housing tax credits or those LURAs, to ensure that it's good housing for the long term, because we are going to hold it for the long term, and we're going to be there, every day managing it and ensuring it's successful for the community. So it's definitely a mixture of them all, and I think it's just being open to conversations and building those public-private partnerships.
Nick, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think that I'd like to just stress the advocacy part, and that is, I really do think that a community, if you're interested in affordable housing, you really do have to champion it and really see it through the process. And sometimes that may put you in uncomfortable situations with your constituents, because sometimes there are going to be tough questions. But if you vet the project, it fits in with your long-term vision for what your community needs. In other words, there's a demographic need for it. We talked about the Ehlers population, which you can probably touch on a little bit, but it's kind of the missing middle that a lot of communities need. But if you identify the need, you have a plan for that need, and frankly, the more that you can put it into your zoning or have it what we call a by right use, where even if there's a big NIMBY movement behind it, basically you have the political, I'll say, ammunition to still champion it, saying it complies with our plan, it complies with zoning, This is what we need. And then therefore it becomes less of a negotiated kind of big unknown black hole. You know, that's the worst situation that a developer can find themselves in, is having spent that 40,000, worse than that, having spent hundreds of thousands by the time you got the plans done, by the time you're really into this process, only to have it completely blow up when it gets in front of the public. So I think that to the extent that a community can do anything to set the stage for it, to look at what obstacles might end up being really big landmines and prepare for those, that is like my biggest advice that makes these projects flow, you know, and that is that championing it, being the advocate, and kind of having the smooth glide path to promote the projects through the finish line.
Couldn't agree more with both Nick and Sig. I would add too that it's really important to involve everybody at the city. I mean, it's one thing to have a few positive conversations with city staff members and you know, but I think the more folks that you can get on board in terms of like people that vote, you know, during city council meetings or whatever, I mean, those, it's all going to be for the better. I mean, we just need to have really open conversations about what the goals are. Whenever we call a community, it's, what are your goals for development? What are your goals for affordable housing? Where does that maybe line up with where you're able to offer financial support to a project? Because as you heard earlier, we need that in order to make it work too. So it's really the political ability to move ahead and the financial ability to move ahead. They're really two drivers to the way I see it to making an affordable housing project work.
So you're, all three of your firms have been active, not just throughout Wisconsin, but you're active in other states as well. So how do you get involved in projects? Maybe give us some examples. I'm assuming periodically you might be responding to an RFP. Independently, you may have other access points of how you're getting connected with communities and maybe properties. Track record, obviously you're all three successful in not just this space, but other types of development. And then are there other areas that we can point to that can get communities ready to accept this type of project coming in? You know, one thing we are seeing are housing studies become more popular as well. Actually, a couple of counties in the metro area, Milwaukee metro area, are actually having independent housing studies done to determine what needs are out there. And those probably will lead to RFPs, would be my guess. So give us an idea of how you get involved in projects, and then I'll pinpoint a few projects that I know you guys have done. But if you can give us an idea of what triggers the process to get involved. So Scott, you want to start with that one?
Sure. You highlighted RFPs. That's one easy way. I mean, a community already identified a need, for example, and they're seeking, you know, external assistance for that. We've been involved with that. I think word of mouth is another powerful way to expedite that. So, I mean, we've been involved in a number of different projects, and you know, all of those have been successful. And so when you have success stories, then another community talks to them, and one thing happens after the next, right? And then also, I think is maybe more of an opportunistic way of looking at it would be for us to just say, okay, well, here's the geographic areas of interest that WIDA has highlighted within its QAP, what communities score well, you know, and we can kind of say, okay, looks like the high scoring areas are over here. Let's call a few of these communities and try to track opportunities down that way. We've done a little of all of those. So I don't think there's any one, you know, perfect way of doing it, but you know, I would just encourage municipalities to identify what their plan might be, and then just reach out to us, you know, any one of us, and just have those conversations, you know.
Nick, do you want to follow up on that?
No, I think Scott hit it around that. I mean, it's a mixture of all of those. I mean, independently sourced. I mean, we do, especially on the LIHTC side, we're more on the supportive housing set aside. So for us, it's, you know, we've we'll hear word of mouth from a nonprofit that's looking to do some sort of supportive housing, and we'll work with them to identify locations as to where they'd be successful, and then knowing, this is a good municipality that we've worked with in the past, or might be open to it, and having those conversations. So it really is a mixture of any of those. And I think the QAP does have some push on it, but RFPs is a great resource too, and a good track record helps.
I think in a prior conversation we had, you mentioned, it was an interesting term, the reverse engineering the QAP. You want to delve into that a little bit more?
Sure. I agree with both Scott and Nick about, how these things come across your desk, right? Brokers may call with an idea. You may have an intern scour, listings. There's a whole bunch of, blunt tools that we can use. But what, because there's so much nuance in the QAP, what we have done, and Scott alluded to this, is more of an opportunist, and we call it, reverse engineering the the QAP, where here's, for example, qualified census tracts, right? A QCT is a certain scoring element. So then we're going to start to look at maps and communities and where are the QCTs. You start to kind of put it through this, McCargian, this grid kind of these overlays, and in the bottom, here's a geographic area that would score well, and what are the opportunities in that area. So I think that's really the concept. And I think that most developers do that in some form or fashion. But really it's you kind of hear about projects in so many different ways, but that is one way that kind of lets you get to the higher scoring project out of the box.
Thanks.
So there are a couple of projects that I wanted to highlight that probably because they're in communities that I represent, so selfishly, and I think they're wonderful projects. And maybe I will start with you, Scott. And the reason I focused on some of these three is I wouldn't say they're necessarily in the metro area. They're kind of a little bit outstate, and they're all kind of interesting projects, just partly because of the geographic nature of them, but also the projects that are being done. So, Scott, you want to talk a little bit about the city of Chilton? It's a senior housing project that's right along the river. I bring it up in part because I hear senior housing a lot, especially in those mid-sized communities. And I have had multiple people I know come to your project to look at it, to kind of see what it looks like. So if you want to talk a little bit about how you got involved in the city of Chilton and what drew you to that.
Yeah, we got involved with the city of Chilton probably over a decade ago now. And they kind of came to us with, here's a site that we would like to redevelop, and it's part of our uptown district. Here's some, things that are happening to revitalize the area. We looked at the opportunity and said, yeah, I think that, it's a smaller community, less than 5,000 people, but it's county seat. There's enough happening there, I think, demographically, that it made sense, and then the other thing too is that the city was very forward thinking in terms of how they would participate in the project financially. So 10 years ago, we developed a 40 unit senior project called Uptown Commons. And then most recently, just a little over, probably 2 years ago now, finished construction on Uptown Commons 2, which is a 24 unit. So we kind of go back to that, here's a successful 40 unit project. Now the city's kind of calling back and saying, hey, here's the site next door to it that is smaller, but we'd still like to be able to move ahead on it. It's, I would say smaller projects are not any less work than larger projects. So, it was probably on the borderline of what we would typically do. But, here's a community of, just a few thousand people. We were able to leverage quite a few different creative resources to make it happen. There was TIF funding that was involved. There was a low interest loan, a couple different loans that the city made to the project. We were able to get home funding from the state, also federal home loan bank funding. I think in total it was probably something like 8 different sources of funding that I was working on, just on a 24 unit project. So very extensive kind of effort there, but in the end, gorgeous project right on the river downtown. And like you said, Phil, it's one that even 10 years later on the first phase that we're pointing back to with a lot of our clients.
Yeah. Nick, can you talk a little bit about what work you're doing in Janesville right now and the project that you were moving forward there?
Yeah, absolutely. So we really got started in that one coming from our history. We've always tried to focus on areas that have that almost that missing middle and putting that housing in areas where we hope it can be successful and forming that partnership. And this one, having done a few historic rehab projects, working with a local family who own the project, and it's been a vacant historic building for 20 plus years. So working on unique ways with the city on TIF financing, combining a few parcels, and having it be true workforce rather than LIHTC housing, where the rents are essentially at 80% of AMI, just based on where that natural community's 80% is, knowing there's absorption there and that we can make it work. So it's trying to find unique ways to get projects done, and not always having to use credits is helpful. And then the city being an integral partner was definitely a big help in that to get that project on the road, which has just started construction and will be hopefully finishing next spring.
Great, thank you. SIG also, again, a little bit outstate, I would call it. Sheboygan Falls, they bought a middle school property that was vacant and converted it into a housing project. Can you talk a little bit about how you got involved there as well, and a little bit about the project?
Sure. Well, that's an interesting one because we were the second developer to take a crack at it. There was an RFP that was issued by the school district several years ago that was seeking a developer to buy the school. And there was an affordable housing developer that won that initial RFP. But at the time, this is one of these unique nuances of the QAP. At the time, there wasn't this ability to do a combination senior and family deal. And so to score, this developer would have needed the whole project to be a family, workforce deal. And the community going basically out to solicit response, it did not go over well, basically. And we were the second developer. We got a call from a friendly broker who said, "Hey, the school might be available. What do you think?" And we said, "Well, gee, it didn't go over really well the first time." But then we looked at the QAP. It just came out and it said, what would happen if we did a senior deal with a combination of some townhomes, like Scott was mentioning? And that's in fact what we did. And the second time around, the community really warmed up to the idea. A lot of the seniors were really excited about it. Many of them actually went to school there, which was pretty unique. And actually several of our residents, during the first open house, walked the halls and were talking about where they went to middle school and stuff, or, which room they were in elementary school. So it was really cool, super rewarding project. It was complicated because it did involve historic credit. Anybody that's done one of those deals, it's not for the faint of heart. You're relying on the National Park Service basically to approve your plans. And then not only that, after you're done, the National Park Service has to approve that you complied with the plans. And every project, as everyone knows, has little things that go wrong. You have a new soffit that needs to be built, or you adjust something. And in this case, we had to just be really careful about working with the National Park Service. And we just got our Part 3 approved. So we're really grateful for that, and kind of just rounded the bend and we're able to close out that project. So.
Great, thank you. They're all interesting projects in their own right, and that's why I thought it'd be nice to hear from you as far as how you got involved in each of those and give some color behind the scenes. We talked a little bit already about what makes developers decide which projects to go through. I don't know if we want to drill down too much more in metro versus outstate, but it sounds like the QAP drives a lot of that, along with maybe responding to an RFP or maybe track record that you have in a community. Is there anything else you want to add to that? I'm sure we have a combination of participants today that are either outstate and or metro communities, and I'm sure even more so the outstate folks are just trying to wondering how do we get involved in this. We've talked about a lot of that already, but anything else you want to add to this slide?
Yeah, I guess I'll add to it that I think in addition to scoring and financial feasibility, which we've talked about, I think there's also, especially as you move into smaller communities, that there's probably also a factor of like market depth that we have to be able to consider as well. You know, it's there's rules of thumb, you know, that we can think through, but certainly any type of project would have to be supported by an independent, you know, market study that shows the capacity for, you know, like if it's a 60 unit project, for example, you have to be able to show that there's enough market depth for a 60 unit project. So that is sort of a constraint. I mean, I've been contacted by, you know, small communities. I'm talking like 1,000 people or less, you know, that want to have you know, it's like you have to have, you know, that the demographics have to support it too. So I think that was just an extra component I wanted to add.
I mean, I'll chime in along those lines that Scott is talking about. Sometimes those more rural counties have lower AMIs, right? They have lower area median incomes. And as Frank talked about early in this presentation, you're looking at qualifying residents based on the percentage of their income against that AMI. And so if you have a county that has an AMI that's, you know, 30% less than a neighboring county, that can become really challenging because somebody that's making, you know, a decent hourly wage and lives in a county with a low AMI may not qualify. So you do kind of push up against some of those, you know, some of those edges.
Yeah, that's where that reverse engineering comes into play, isn't it?
Indeed.
Well, we've certainly talked quite a bit about capital stack, and one of the key components that we wanted to put on the table is tax increment districts. And, you know, we kind of asked the question, is it always necessary? In Wisconsin, I think you're aware we don't have as many resources to tap into for that capital stack. You mentioned what's available in other states like Colorado that Wisconsin currently doesn't have. So I think the short answer is probably yes in most cases, but can you have maybe a little nuance on this? You know, we are allowed now through the life of a tax increment district in that final year to be able to collect revenue for one additional year to use for affordable housing. I'm not sure how familiar you are with that provision, but have you been able to tap into that at all in any community that you've been working with? Do you want to take that one first, Nick?
Sure. I mean, I think especially on LIHTC projects, I mean, tax incremental financing is always a big help. It may not be needed in all situations, especially in your more downtown, truly metro areas. It may not be a necessary item to use. There could be other financing sources, but especially with the market right now, if you're in a 9% credit and you're doing ground up and you're stick built outside of your what you call outstate, it's very likely going to be a necessary piece to get a project done, whether that's even just to lower the tax basis or to help fill that capital stack, especially in lower AMI communities. For market rates or workforce housing and a lot of the projects we're working on, it really is a needed factor to ensure a project can get done in those communities, to ensure you can meet your investor needs and your lender needs. So, and it definitely is a great tool that we can use here in Wisconsin that not all states have.
Yeah, and I guess, Phil, if you don't mind, I'll broaden the question and say, financial participation in general, the answer is yes in my book. You know, we need financial participation, that public-private partnership in some way, shape, or form. How that occurs doesn't necessarily have to be TIF, but that seems to be the most frequent tool that is pointed to in today's time. You know, there's other markets like Nick was alluding to that you know, there may be an affordable housing fund set up, or, some other resource that's there that would maybe take the place of that. But there just has to be some financial part. I just haven't done a project in recent years that hasn't had some component of financial assistance. So it's one of the first, it's one of the first things that we're talking about. Unfortunately, I don't like to get to that too quickly when you're talking with municipalities, but it's really kind of cutting to the chase of like, is your community able to participate? And if you're not, then it may not be the right fit right now, right?
Yeah. Well, moving on to kind of broader vision, a couple of issues that we wanted to get on the table as well. One is multifamily developments. There are a few communities out there that have had a lot of activity, a lot of multifamily developed. I've been standing in front of a few village boards that say, don't bring us any more multifamily. And so I don't know if we're getting a little pushback from a political will standpoint. But question for the group, I guess, are we now seeing any resistance or saturation in the multifamily market? A lot of the growth that we've seen over the last 5 years has been multifamily. Single family is certainly catching up again. But Sig, do you want to talk a little bit about what you're seeing in the market and if you are seeing any pushback on multifamily developments?
I will say that most recently, meaning in the last several years, I have seen more acceptance of multifamily as a product type than any other time in my career. And this is going into like 20 plus years doing this. It used to be that communities would always say, well, there's a difference between condos and multifamily. This is rental versus owned, owner occupied. And I think that, post 2008 or whatever, that maybe people saw that wasn't always a panacea solution. There are a lot of condo projects that got in trouble. There's a lot of stalled projects. But I think that the whole condo craze, if you want to call it that, gave the whole idea of multifamily living kind of this stamp of legitimacy or something like that, or of acceptance. And I think that really it's become more of a lifestyle question. And I at least have seen that multifamily is very accepted as a product type. However, much more focused on the quality. A lot of communities have design guidelines, which I actually encourage. It's actually useful for developers to understand what the rules of the game are going to be. But, things like no vinyl siding, we want high quality natural materials, high quality finishes, things like that. To the point where in one community, we had that written into a development agreement, and so I would say that it's less resistance to multifamily as a product type as it is to quality of it.
Yeah, just to add to that briefly would be when we talk about affordable housing specifically, I really haven't encountered a single community that hasn't needed more affordable or any affordable housing. I mean, we've seen quite a demand in a lot of communities that we've looked at. So just kind of quick answer to that is I'm not seeing any type of saturation in affordable housing anyway. So we continue to be interested in that in a lot of different communities.
Nick, do you want to add anything?
Same thing. With market rate housing, I think there's been some resistance. Workforce and low income housing tax credits, again, it's filling that missing middle right now that really could use the housing. And to Stig's point, the quality. I know we've worked in communities and had certain quality standards, and we're happy to meet them to an extent. And we'll work with the community to ensure that the product meets them long term, because we know we're committing to that community for a long term as well.
To kind of follow up on Phil's experiences too, I've had a number of communities who are preferring to have apartments being built as to be efficient in keeping units together and having more density that relieves some of the stress on some of the public infrastructure and services that need to be provided as well. Rather than a larger single family sprawl development, they have immediate access to fire, police, et cetera, in a smaller contained area. So some of the communities are actually pushing for or supportive of multifamily development rather than resisting that.
I mean, I've actually had the unique experience of a couple communities saying that's not enough units. It's like, wow, I didn't expect to hear that, So I think that you're absolutely right. There's I think there's just a renewed awareness of, the efficiency of infrastructure, that density equals more shoppers in a shopping district. Density equals, more just population growth, kind of more housing alternatives for a community. I think that most communities appreciate that they can't be kind of one size fits all, that having a variety of housing in a community is really what makes it tick, what gives it long-term sustainability. I think that there's just a greater awareness to that.
Yeah, and I think you spoke to the quality issue as well. I think that allows for the acceptance of that as well. That more and more projects are higher rent, more amenities provided to tenants lead to that acceptance.
On-site management being another piece that we hear about on a regular basis as well when appropriate. So a question that popped up that I thought before we get to kind of final thoughts, question was on historic tax credits. And someone's going to have to interpret this for me that's more averse in historic tax credits. For historic tax credits, is it always NPS or can it be SHPO? Is one easier to work with? So, who's the historic tax credit guru that wants to take that one?
Well, I can just tell you, technically speaking, it's both.
Right.
Technically, It's both. The way that it works when you get historic preservation tax credits is that you go through a multi-stage process, and through that process, the SHPO, or the State Historic Preservation Office, is actually the first screen and is really like the almost acts as the early staff, right? The first screen to the National Park Service, but ultimately it goes to the National Park Service and has to be approved there. And once it's approved there, is you get the piece of paper that's worth the millions of dollars. So it's both.
Okay. Anybody else want to add anything to that? Because I can't, so I'm relying on the experts.
Even dealing with.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just to say, even SHPO, you also get to deal with, even if it's just in a historic district, or even if you're not doing historic tax credits, local historical districts. I mean, again, that comes into just understanding the nuances of each community and whether the building's on the state registry, the national registry. There's a lot that go into it, and having both SHPO and the national parks does add a lot more layers and time sometimes.
Yeah, I saw one question pop up, and we kind of glossed over it a bit, but there was a question asking what's the difference between the 4% and the 9% credits. Part of it is the time that you receive those, but if you, Nick, maybe you might elaborate a little bit more on that too.
Sure.
Just for a basic understanding.
Just a very, very basic overline. I mean, the 9% tax credit is really a lot of what we've been talking about now. The December process getting awarded in April. Wisconsin does have, again, what you call a competitive 4%. The 4% is typically used more for rehabs of projects. I mean, you've got the 4% bond that's used to either rehab an existing either multifamily building or non-multifamily building, versus the 9% almost always going to be a ground up or a larger rehab project. Is a very basic understanding. I know Sig, you just got awarded on both, yeah. So I assume you probably have more of an understanding, at least on this year.
No, I mean, it's just super basically. The state of Wisconsin introduced a 4% credit that went on top of the 4% federal credit. And basically, that creates essentially like the 8 versus the 9, you could almost say, right? And that's just based on your eligible basis of project cost. You multiply that times that percentage, and that generates your tax credit request, right? And then times 10 years. So that's kind of the basic math. They're a little different. And we find that you need stronger rent on a 4% deal just to kind of make the numbers work. Usually a little more of a stretch on the soft money on a 4% deal. Competition wise, we're finding that both programs now are getting pretty darn competitive.
Great, thank you. So really the last slide, I'm going to ask each of you to look into your crystal ball and help us understand kind of the future housing needs in the state of Wisconsin, what you're seeing on the horizon, and tell us if you expect to be really active in this market, or do you see that that need that we're hearing about for both workforce, affordable, and senior housing diminishing, or is that going to continue to grow? So, Scott, you want to kick it off?
Yeah, no, we project that this is going to remain a very competitive market and a growing market into the future. Particularly we think there's demographic reasons why I think senior housing is going to continue to grow with the aging population. But I also think more broadly, just with affordable housing, that the attractiveness of the funding platform really, and kind of what we got back to earlier with how much, how much equity is generated to each project. Really, and especially given where construction costs have been, and I don't know when construction costs are going to stop going up, but they are going up, and it's just getting more and more difficult to finance traditional market rate deals unless you've got high rent areas. And so given that constraint and kind of this growing demographic, I really think affordable housing is going to remain strong for the foreseeable future.
Nick, do you want to add on?
I'll agree. I think there's always going to be, and there always will be, a need for affordable housing, and whether that's rehabilitation or ground up development, it's going to continue to be a big need for communities. And for us, we're looking at those projects and into market rate projects, because I still think there's a huge need for housing, well, throughout the country, especially here in Wisconsin. And I think one area we're seeing lately is workforce, that missing middle, and trying to find communities that know that they can support it. And the other odd one is going to be just single family homes and development of single family homes as either rental properties, because that's going to be another area where you've got a lot of families moving that are looking for that, or more family style housing. And I can see, and Sig, maybe Scott, you could say on this, I think there's still going to be a push for more family sized units going into affordable and workforce housing.
Yeah, I don't see that changing, and I'll say unfortunately, right? Yeah. So in 2020, the latest, we call it the Ehlers, well, we don't, United Way calls it the Ehlers report, which is the asset limited, income constrained, but employed, right? That missing middle, that 34% of Wisconsin households were in that Ehlers category, which is a third of the households in the state of Wisconsin. So that basically means that they're struggling to make ends meet, even though they have a job. And I think that when you think about the power of this resource and kind of the ideal scenario between public and private, we're the developers who are at risk. It's our risk to fill these. It's our risk to build them on budget and on time, to get all the financing. And the government's role is really it's a supply side role, right? To just help bring the cost of the project down, but we're responsible for the rest of it. And I think that it's a super powerful platform with, unfortunately, that demand, with an almost unlimited demand. I don't think you can build the stuff fast enough for how much demand there is generally in the state right now.
Well, I guess that's not necessarily good news, but good news for you folks, maybe. You'll stay busy going forward, and we expect to see your faces in a lot of our municipal clients that we serve. So I have no further questions that have come forward from our question and answer. Does anybody else want to add anything before we wrap up today? Hearing none, thank you guys. Really appreciate it. So that's all we have for today. I want to thank for their insights and discussion, and thanks to all of you for taking time out of your busy day to join us. Please note Both a copy of today's presentation and a recording of the session will be posted to our virtual attendee hub for your future reference. And because we're always interested in learning about ways we can make our virtual experience more dynamic and deliver content that is most valuable to you, we will send you a brief survey in the next couple of days. We do hope you take time to give us your thoughts on what we did well and what we can do better. Thank you again for attending. Enjoy the rest of your day.